Echoes in the walls. Elias lay in his cold room, his only comfort the weak light filtering through the barred window. At night, the walls whispered, not with real voices, but with the echoes of other people's suffering, a constant, unbearable hum of pain and despair that the boy felt in his nightmares. It seemed to be sealed within the very stones of the building. He felt as if he weren't sleeping in a room, but at the bottom of a well filled with the memories of strangers. The next morning, he was woken by Finch's assistant, the same pale, thin young man whose face Elias had seen in his recent vision. His name was Tobias. He brought Elias a bowl of oatmeal and a glass of milk, but his movements were unnaturally stiff, and his eyes constantly darted around the room, as if searching for something or someone. He avoided making direct eye contact. Finch is waiting for you, Tobias said quietly, his voice trembling. Be careful. Elias looked at him, and a vague vision flashed in his mind, Tobias's face, contorted in pain, and a sound like the grinding of metal. But the boy said nothing. He followed Tobias to Finch's laboratory. The lab was even more unnerving than the study. Along the walls were glass cabinets where organs floated in jars, seeming to grin hideously in the dim light. On the tables were strange instruments, surgical saws, gleaming forceps, and some unknown devices of copper and glass. In the center of the room stood a massive table, more like an operating table than a workbench. Finch sat at his desk, hunched over a journal. Elias, take a seat, he said without looking up. He gestured to a chair across from him. Today we will begin our investigation. We must understand exactly what is happening in your mind. Finch began to ask questions that were far too complex for an 8-year-old. He asked about the nature of his visions. Did he see colors, hear sounds, or feel smells? He recorded every word Elias said in his thick journal. Then, he pulled a box full of crystal spheres and metal rods from a drawer. We will call this the resonance scanner, Finch explained, his eyes glowing. This device is capable of detecting and amplifying the energetic imprints left by the mind. He asked Elias to hold one of the rods while he waved another over his head. Elias felt a slight tingling sensation, and then those same horrible whispers rang out in his mind again, only this time they were louder, clearer, as if thousands of voices were screaming in his ears. He fell from the chair, writhing in pain, and covered his ears with his hands, but it did no good. Finch, instead of showing concern, frantically scribbled notes. It is incredible. The amplifier works, the resonance. It is so strong the boy can't control it. Tobias, who had been standing by the door, rushed to Elias, trying to help him up. Doctor, this is too cruel. He is just a child. Finch gave him a cold look. Silence, Tobias, science requires sacrifice. We must understand the limits of this phenomenon. Elias, pushing through the pain, looked at Tobias, and in his mind, amidst the general chaos, he heard one distinct voice. They changed them. They changed them. Elias gasped in terror. He didn't know what it meant, but it was not the scream of a dying person. It was the quiet, fearful whisper of a living one, satisfied with the results. Finch ended the experiment. That is enough for today, he said. I have recorded everything I need. You may take the boy to his room. Tobias carefully lifted Elias. The boy was too weak to walk on his own, and Tobias had to carry him. As they walked down the corridors, Elias pressed against Tobias and whispered in his ear, You are afraid. Tobias flinched. How did you know? I heard, Elias whispered. I hear everything. What are they doing to you? Tobias shook his head, a look of profound fear on his face. Nothing, he said, but Elias knew it was a lie. He could feel his fear, and it was not of Finch, but of something else, something that was hidden within the academy itself. When they reached his room, Tobias set him down on the bed. He looked at Elias with sympathy, and then his gaze fell on his hand. Elias felt his hand on his own, and in that moment, his consciousness was once again filled with a stranger's voice. But this time, it was not the voice of a dying person. It was Tobias's voice, and it was filled with regret and helplessness. I am sorry, I couldn't help them. They were children, they were. Like you. Tobias quickly left, locking the door behind him. Elias was left alone, his head buzzing with the cacophony of other people's pain. But now, among those voices, he heard a new one, a whisper of despair coming from Tobias. He realized with a terrifying clarity that Finch was using his gift for something terrible, and that he was not the first child to fall into his hands. Trapped within the walls of this academy, Elias was the key to unlocking its darkest secret. The underground echoes. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. For Elias, the days were filled with Drive, Finch's endless experiments. He would sit connected to bizarre machines while Finch waved his resonance scanners over his head. The nights were even worse. In the darkness of his room, the voices of the dead and the living merged into a single, terrifying chorus. But amidst the chaos, something new emerged. The voice of Tobias, which Elias had heard the day he touched his hand, became clearer. It was not like the echo of a dying person. It was the voice of memory, the voice of regret. Elias began to understand. Tobias could not speak openly, but his fear and despair told a story. A story about children who were brought to the academy and how they disappeared. Below ground, Tobias's voice whispered in Elias's mind. They ray down there, where there is no light. They come for them at night, one day, during yet another experiment, when Drive, Finch was particularly absorbed in his notes. Elias dared to ask a question. Drive, Finch, he asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. That boy I saw in the painting in the corridor, where is he? Finch didn't even look up. Which boy? There are many paintings, don't get distracted. Elias. His name? I think his name was Caleb. Elias knew the name. He had heard it in one of his nightmares, in a scream that was not a scream of death. He looked like me. Finch's head snapped up, his green eyes narrowing. There is no one like you. You are unique. Now be silent until we are finished. But it was too late. Elias knew he was right. He was not the first. And Tobias was not the only one who was afraid. That night, Elias decided to take a risk. He waited until the corridors were empty, and when a complete silence fell, he quietly approached the door. The lock, as always, was bolted, but Elias noticed a small crack in the floor directly beneath the door. He took a thin metal rod from his bag, which he had kept for self-defense, and began to work on the crack. After a long effort, he managed to widen the gap enough to pull the rod out, and then he used it to pick the lock. Slowly and quietly, he slipped out into the dark corridor. He knew where he needed to go. His gift didn't just show him visions, it gave him a kind of map of fear and despair. This path led down into the depths of the academy, to a place where he was forbidden to go. He descended a narrow, winding staircase that went deep underground. Every step was accompanied by an echo and intensified the cold. Cobwebs hung from the walls, and the air carried the smell of dampness and decay. He could hear water dripping below, and somewhere in the distance a strange, low hum. Finally, he reached the very bottom. There was a heavy iron door. He pressed his ear to the cold metal and felt that the voices that constantly hummed in his head were now louder. There were dozens, if not hundreds of voices, and they were filled with fear. They were the voices of children. The door was locked, and Elias knew he couldn't open it. But then his gaze fell on a small window at eye level. He peered inside and saw a nightmare that made his blood run cold. It was a large, semi-dark room. In the center was that same massive table where Drive, Finch and his assistants worked. Cages were placed along the walls, and inside them were children. Some were tied to chairs, others were simply sitting, their eyes empty and vacant. Strange wires were attached to their heads, which were connected to the machines that produced the low hum Elias had heard from the stairs. Elias saw Caleb. His eyes were closed, his head was connected to the machine, and his face was contorted in agony. He was not dead, but he was not alive either. He was somewhere in between, and his voice in Elias's head was a voice of pain. In that moment, Elias understood the true horror of his gift. Drive. Finch did not want to cure him. He was using his ability to absorb other people's suffering. He didn't just hear the voices of the dead, he heard their fear. And Drive. Finch didn't just want to control him, he wanted to use him to drain the suffering from others, like wringing water from a wet sponge. And, apparently, he was not the first one he had used for this purpose. Suddenly, the door he had descended through opened. Elias turned and saw a silhouette. It was Tobias. He looked frightened, but his eyes were filled with determination. Elias, you shouldn't have come down here, he whispered, his voice full of despair. Now you know. I should have warned you, but I couldn't. I was so afraid. What is he doing to them? Elias whispered, his voice trembling. Why are their eyes empty? Tobias lowered his head. Drive, Finch, he is taking their memories and their emotions. He is using them to power his machine and create something else, changing them, Elias said, his voice barely audible. That is what you meant. Tobias nodded. He says it is for the sake of science, for humanity, but it is not. He is doing it for power, to control suffering and pain. At that moment, a sound came from deep within the room that made Elias scream. It was a cry filled with terror and pain, a cry that did not belong to any of the trapped children, but belonged to the man whose body lay on the table. It was the cry of Drive. Finch, Elias and Tobias exchanged glances. In their eyes was the same question: what was happening? Feedback loop. Drive. Finch's scream was not a cry of fear, but one of pure agony. It was filled with a pain that could only come from a body not just hurt, but destroyed from within. Elias and Tobias, forgetting their own danger, crept closer to the small window. Finch lay on the operating table, his body unnaturally contorted. The very machine that Tobias had said absorbed memories now hung above him. Blue electrical sparks shot from the wires connected to it, and the doctor himself was entangled in them like a spider's web. His eyes were rolled back, and foam gathered at his mouth. What is happening? Elias whispered. A feedback loop, Tobias said, his voice barely audible. The machine, it doesn't just take, it can also give back. He tried to take too much, and it is returning all the pain he took from others. Elias stared into the room. The children in the cages, those whose eyes had been empty, were now stirring. Some blinked slowly, while others moaned softly. Their bodies, as if waking from a long sleep, were returning to life. The pain that Finch had taken from them was now being returned to him. In that moment, Drive, Finch made one last, desperate movement. He reached for the nearest wire, trying to tear it off, but at the same instant, a new wave of pain engulfed his body. His scream became even louder, more piercing, and then it abruptly cut off. His eyes, once filled with mad greed, were now empty. He had become just like the children from whom he had stolen their life. Silence. Elias and Tobias, shaken, continued to watch through the window. Tobias finally let out a sigh of relief. "He is dead," he said, his voice full of a strange calm. His machine, it consumed him. He became the victim of his own monstrous invention. Elias knew this was not entirely true. He felt that Finch was not simply dead. His mind, his pain, his fear, all of it had become part of the same echo chamber as everything he had ever taken. Now, Finch was just another voice in Elias's head. Tobias, as if reading the boy's mind, shook his head. "No, Elias, he is not just another voice, he is all the voices." He became his own experiment. He is forever trapped in the machine he created, endlessly re-experiencing the suffering of all his victims. Elias stepped back from the door. He felt that his gift had changed. Instead of just hearing the echoes of other people's pain, he now felt it. He had become a living resonance scanner, and all the pain that Finch had collected was now inside him. He was overwhelmed with feelings and emotions that were not his own. He felt the despair of the children, the madness of Finch, and the deep, hopeless emptiness that he himself had brought into their lives. Suddenly, the door leading into the underground lab opened. Tobias quickly hid behind some crates. In the doorway appeared another of Drive, Finch's assistants. He was younger than Tobias and looked terrified. "Tobias," he whispered, "did you hear that scream? I think the doctor did something." "Yes," Tobias replied, emerging from his hiding place. "He did. He finished his experiment." The young assistant peered into the room and saw Drive, Finch's lifeless body. He was speechless. What happened?" he asked. "He paid for his sins," Tobias said. "That machine, it is not just a scientific invention, it is a curse that he put on himself. We have to free the children, we have to destroy that machine." Tobias grabbed Elias by the hand. "We have to run. I'll help you get out of here, but you have to promise me that you'll never come back. You must use your gift to help others, not to be a prisoner like these children." Elias nodded. He didn't know how he would live. He was filled with other people's suffering, but he was free. He was ready for a new path. At that moment, a deafening explosion ripped through the lab. The machine that Finch had built overloaded and burst apart, tearing at wires and shattering the glass jars of organs. The children in the cages began to scream, but this time their cries were not of fear, but of relief. "Run," Tobias cried. He grabbed Elias's hand, and they ran up the stairs, leaving behind the destroyed lab and the bodies that had become part of its history. They burst out into the street. The night was cold and dark, and they merged with the shadows, disappearing into the city. Elias knew that his journey was just beginning. He was no longer just a boy with a gift, but a living archive who carried the stories of others' lives, of others' suffering. He was the Echo Chamber Archives, the living archive. The city of Philadelphia, a maze of cobbled streets and flickering gas lamps, was both a sanctuary and a cage. Elias and Tobias moved like ghosts through the alleys, their faces smudged with soot and their clothes torn. The echo of the explosion at the academy was a distant thunder, but the emotional cacophony in Elias's mind was a storm that raged without end. Drive. Finch's death had not brought peace. It had magnified Elias's curse tenfold. The pain, fear, and sorrow that Finch had siphoned from his victims were now Elias's to carry. He felt the phantom cries of the children in the cages, the lingering despair of the women and man from his earlier visions, and now, a new, agonizing layer of madness that belonged to Drive. Finch himself, Finch's mind, a twisted archive of suffering, was now fused with his own. Elias was no longer just an echo chamber, he was a living library of human torment. Tobias, seeing the boy's struggle, found a temporary shelter in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Inside, away from the prying eyes of the city, he tended to Elias, his hands shaking as he gave him water. "It will pass, Elias," Tobias whispered, though his eyes held no conviction. "The voices, they will fade." "They ray not fading," Elias said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "They ray getting stronger. He is here, Finch is here, I can feel him." He closed his eyes, his small body trembling. He could see flashes of Finch's memories, the obsessive scribbling, the cold, calculating look in his eyes, the satisfaction of a successful experiment. It was all within him, Tobias said with him, his own fears palpable. He had been a low-level assistant, an unwilling participant in Finch's madness, but he had known enough to be terrified. He had seen the children, brought in under false pretenses, their spirits slowly drained away. He had wanted to help them, but he was a prisoner himself, too afraid to defy the doctor. "I found a way to resist him," Tobias confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "He tried to take my empathy, but I held on to it. I held on to the memory of my little sister, who died. I held on to my love for her." He couldn't take that. A new idea sparked in Elias's mind. Love, a feeling so alien to the darkness that now lived within him. He was a vessel of suffering, but perhaps there was an antidote. He thought of his parents, Mary and Henry. He pictured his mother's face, etched with worry, and his father's hopeful smile. He remembered the warmth of their hands and the sound of their voices. He focused on that feeling, pushing against the rising tide of fear and pain. The screams of the trapped children, the whispers of the dead, even Finch's cold laughter, they were still there, but they were now distant, muffled, like a radio with a weak signal. He had found his anchor. "I can control it," Elias whispered, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I can focus on other things, I can push them back." Tobias looked at him, his face a mixture of awe and relief. "Then you are not a victim, Elias, you are the cure." They knew they couldn't stay in the city. Drive. Finch's death would surely lead to an investigation, and they would be sought. They had to leave, but Elias now had a purpose. He would not just run from his curse, he would embrace it. He would use his living archive to seek out those who had been lost, whose spirits still lingered in forgotten places. He would become a silent witness, a protector of the forgotten. The two of them, the boy who saw the dead and the man who was too afraid to save them, left Philadelphia under the cover of night. Their journey was not an escape, but a beginning. The whispering of the Appalachian, their journey took them west, following the setting sun and the trail of forgotten stories. Elias, with his mind a constant symphony of suffering, was now a guide. He didn't need maps or signposts. He simply followed the strongest echoes of pain, the places where tragedy had left a deep scar on the land. His destination was the Appalachian Mountains, a place steeped in folklore and isolated history, a perfect hunting ground for his newfound purpose. Tobias, loyal and quiet, followed. He was the anchor, the practical mind that kept Elias grounded. He found them food and shelter, negotiated with weary mountain folk, and protected the boy from those who saw his strange behavior as a sign of madness. He had seen the truth, and for him, the horrifying reality of what Elias carried was a burden he chose to share. They arrived in a small, remote settlement in West Virginia, a place where time seemed to have stopped a century ago. The town was nestled in a valley, shrouded in a perpetual mist. The people were gaunt and suspicious, their eyes carrying a shared, unspoken grief. This was a place with a powerful, lingering echo. Elias felt it the moment they stepped into the valley. A wave of collective dread, a palpable sense of loss that hummed in the very air. He closed his eyes and saw a horrifying tableau. A large, close-knit family, their faces filled with love and laughter, then a flash of a terrible storm, and then nothing. An abrupt, violent disappearance. He saw the same people again, but their bodies were twisted into unnatural shapes, their faces filled with an eternal, silent scream. The Donnelly family, a new voice, a whisper of a memory, entered Elias's mind. It was a fragment of a conversation, filled with fear. They were changed. The mountain claimed them. Tobias, seeing Elias's distress, guided him to an old, weathered inn. Inside, the fire crackled, but the warmth did little to chase away the chill of the place. Elias sat by the hearth, shivering, his mind reeling with the visions. He saw the Donnelly family, a large group of men, women, and children, gathered on a homestead. They were not from this time. They were from the 1870s, as the fragments of memory told him. They were strong, proud people, but something had come for them. It wasn't a serial killer, or a monster, or a disease. It was something else, something natural, yet unnatural. He saw a dark, swirling cloud of mist descend from the mountain. It wasn't a normal fog, it was thick and alive, and as it touched the Donnelly family, their bodies began to twist and contort. Their limbs stretched, their features blurred, and their bones cracked with an awful sound. The echo in Elias's mind was a symphony of agony. The family was not killed, they were reshaped. They were being absorbed by the mountain itself, their bodies and minds twisted into something grotesque and horrifying. Suddenly, a voice, clearer than the others, spoke directly to him. It was the voice of a little girl, one of the Donnelly children. "He is a good man, this new one, he sees us, please tell them. Tell them we are here, trapped, we are a part of the mountain now. We are a warning." Elias's eyes snapped open. He looked at Tobias, a new determination in his gaze. "The Donnelly family," he said, his voice stronger now. "They weren't killed. They were absorbed by the mountain. They became a part of it. They are still here." Tobias looked at him with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Elias, you saw them. I didn't see them." Elias replied, "I felt them. All of them, and they want me to tell their story. They want to be heard." He realized then what his true purpose was. He was not just a repository of suffering, he was a conduit. He was the one who could give voice to the voiceless, to the victims of tragedies that were too bizarre or horrific for history to remember. He was here not to suffer, but to speak for them. This was his burden, but it was also his salvation. The price of echoes. Elias and Tobias spent a week in the Appalachian Valley. Elias, no longer fighting the voices, embraced them. He walked the land, his mind a symphony of the Donnelly family's final moments. He saw their joy, their terror, and the horrifying finality of their transformation. He and Tobias carefully documented everything, not in a scientific journal, but in a simple notebook. Elias described the visions, the swirling, living mist, the agonizing reshaping of their bodies, and the lingering sense of being a part of the mountain. Tobias, with his neat handwriting, transcribed the details, adding his own observations of the strange, unsettling quiet that hung over the valley. They learned that the local townsfolk knew of the tragedy, but spoke of it in hushed whispers. They believed it was a curse, a family swallowed by the vengeful spirit of the mountain. Elias, however, knew the truth was far more complex and terrifying. The Donnelly family had not been killed, they had become an eternal part of the land, their existence a living warning. On their final night in the valley, Elias sat by the fire, his mind finally at peace. He had fulfilled his purpose, he had listened to the victims, and he was ready to tell their story. But there was one last echo he had to face. It was not a voice of a victim, but the cold, calculating presence of drive. Finch. Finch's voice, a chilling whisper in his mind, returned, "You think you are free, boy. You are my greatest creation. I showed you the truth, that human suffering is a resource. You will never escape me. Every echo you chase, every story you tell, is my legacy. You are nothing more than my greatest experiment, a walking archive of all the pain I collected. And you will be forever alone." Elias shuddered, but he no longer felt fear. He felt pity. He was not trapped, he was a vessel for the truth, and he had a partner. He looked at Tobias, who was sleeping soundly, and a sense of profound gratitude washed over him. Tobias was not afraid of his curse. He had chosen to share it. He reached into his mind, past the screams and the whispers, and found the memory of his parents' love. He focused on it, making it a shield against Finch's venomous words. He felt the darkness recoil. Finch's voice became a faint, powerless hiss, a distant echo swallowed by a much stronger emotion. Elias had found the key to his freedom. He was not a victim of his gift, but its master. His ability was a price he had to pay, a burden he had to carry, but in return, he was granted a sacred trust to be the voice of the dead and the forgotten. He would travel the world, following the echoes of history, and with Tobias by his side, he would tell their stories. The next morning, as the sun rose over the mist-shrouded peaks of the Appalachians, Elias and Tobias walked away from the valley. They left behind a story that would one day be told, a chilling tale of a family that was not lost, but became one with the mountain. Elias was no longer a frightened boy. He was the echo chamber archives, a living testament to the human stories that history forgot to tell. His journey had just begun.